So please raise your hand if you want to make something, okay?
So my question is inside of an acknowledgement that you pointed out. The war is not the answer. And my question is, how do we begin to mobilize groups like this to have the discussion, to mobilize, to be engaged, to be involved, given with all this coming out of COVID and, we question gatherings, but your comments were so inspirational. So, give the rest of us, access to that kind of inspiration so that we can mobilize and energize and have people come to have the conversation.
I'll give you a couple of tools that would be useful. One is a coalition called Peace in Ukraine, and it's got a website, peaceinukraine.org. People can join it as an organization. You can also join as an individual. Every 2 weeks the group meets. It's just an hour commitment every 2 weeks to talk about what can we do. And people break up groups online and talk about what they're doing. For example, there's a woman who goes every week to the farmer's market, and she puts up a table that says a sign, "Let's talk about Ukraine." And she finds the most stimulating discussions, and she doesn't push people. She has a petition there. At the end, she said almost everybody wants to sign a petition calling for peace. We have those petitions, we have flyers, we have all kinds of resources on that website. So that's one possibility. The other, because we're in a Quaker meeting house now, is to say that one of the most successful things that we've done is mobilize people in the faith-based community, particularly leaders in the faith-based community. So this was before Christmas time. We came up with the idea that the Europeans were doing of calling for a Christmas truce. And we figured, with the difficult environment in the US, let's have a goal of getting 100 faith-based leaders to call for that truce. In about 2 weeks' time, we had 1,500. And they included Reverend Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Jesse Jackson, all kinds of people, that really brought a sense of moral clarity to this issue. And so we're encouraging people in their communities to go out to their faith leaders and have them continue to sign what is now an updated position just calling for negotiations. So that's just some suggestions, and I think we'll have more as we continue the discussion.
Thanks, Medea, for coming back to Atlanta. And I'm glad to meet a lot of the Quakers. I'm not a Quaker, I'm a Catholic, but I also attend a Russian Orthodox church, Russia outside of the country, the RSC. And I came down after the service telling people, and what I want to say is, I do respect your beliefs in pacifism, in being a medic, but not picking up the gun. That takes tons of courage. That takes more courage than most people have. So I'm glad that we're having this meeting. But the people at the Orthodox Church are very split, very angry about the war. Half Ukrainian are there, half Russian. There's a mix of opinions, and they're sick. They think it's basically a civil war. Is what they think it is, a civil war, and they're slaughtering each other. Brother Slavs. They're all Slavic. All speak Ukraine, Russian. They go to the Orthodox Church, they're baptized in the church, and they're killing each other. And I don't think anybody at the top of NATO really cares about the casualties, about the devastation of those districts, of those Donetsk, Luhansk. And I think it's almost like a strategic board game that they're playing out like they did in Syria, and you're on top of that. And we have to say one thing about Putin. He stopped the proxy war in Syria. He stopped it pretty much cold because they were going to get overrun and the whole state was going to revert to jihadism under the black flag. And it was all for oil pipelines from Qatar, which you figured that out. Okay. But getting back to the Russia-Ukraine war, I'm really concerned. I've come from an Army veteran family of 3 wars. I see this as leading us into a nuclear war with Russia. Because Russia has red lines, America has red lines. You cannot put troops, NATO nuclear missiles in Ukraine, which is 5 minutes to Moscow. Just like we won't allow nuclear weapons on our Mexican border or Canadian border or in Cuba. There's a bunch of people that are leading us into this war. they know, most of the generals know that Russia will eventually prevail. Russia doesn't want all of Ukraine. I think it wants to get out of this. They don't have an off-ramp. So what I'm saying is, you guys can get slow launched into this World War III, because if anything happens in the Crimea, it's game on. And you know what cities are going to be hit? Atlanta, Savannah, the nuclear sub bases. When it goes nuclear, our whole country is going to be gone. If it goes to that,
I'll have
if
to
it goes
ask
to
you
that
to
extent.
try to
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just saying, that's what we're up against. I think we need to mobilize right from this
Thank you
point
for
forward.
So I'm a member of North Decatur Presbyterian Church and our Peace and Justice Committee. I think they hadn't read your book, but they were glad to have a discussion about peace. And I too am so desperate for peace in Ukraine. The conundrum I've always had all my life is when we say war is not the answer. What do you do when the Third Reich invades Poland? War is not the answer, but I can't imagine what else we do at that moment. So I joined the Peace Corps in my youth. I went to Russia and met wonderful Russian people and was so angry at the Clinton administration and how it was allowing thieves to take over what could have been a democracy. There could have been another Russia. And then I became very integrated into the Russian and Ukrainian community here. And I think what my concern is when I hear your lesson, which is not a discussion, it's a lesson, is how very one-sided it is and how it leaves apart context. I mean, for example, yes, 48% of Americans in the recent poll support the army in Ukraine. 29% oppose it. The vast majority just, they're not engaged or they don't have an offense. The conflict in Luhansk and Donbass and Donetsk, that conflict was started by Russia. Russian soldiers invaded. Russian soldiers came and have been embroiling that conflict ever since. And I think, there's certainly slaughter now. Last year, or before the invasion, I think, 18 people died in the Donbass. But Crimea, the alleged uprising, wonderful journalists were there and were able to report that the little green men that started the invasion of Crimea by Russia had license plates from the Russian military base that they had stripped off the Russian insignia, but forgot to take that. So all that said, I think that the United States has made terrible decisions, and George Bush, just one of his gifts to the world, was that half measure of saying, someday we will expand Ukraine into NATO, which put everybody on edge and felt like a betrayal in Russia, and yet did nothing. And so, as tensions were boiling with Russia, some Ukrainians are reminding Biden, hey, you said you'd expand NATO. And he's fighting. Anyway, all that to say, what breaks my heart here is that we don't have a Ukrainian voice. Where is the Ukrainian refugee from Luhansk, from Donbass, from the east, giving their truth to your truth? And this would be a very different retelling of history. And if I
Perhaps
Medea
could respond.
I have one, yes, and so that is one last thing. And so just because primary sources are so important, I want to read what Putin said as he prepared to begin the invasion. Any people, and particularly the Russian people, will always be able to tell apart the patriots from the scum and traitors and spit them out like a fly that accidentally flew into their mouths. I am convinced that this natural and necessary self-cleansing of society will only strengthen our country, our solidarity, cohesion, and readiness to meet any challenge. But he talks about the millions of people in the West understand that they are being led to a real spiritual catastrophe. The elites are just going crazy. Well, he talks about marriage being between a man and a woman, and that this is all an attempt by the West to impose gay parades on Russia and Ukraine. So anyway, so my question to you is, why would you,
No, that's fine, that's
why
fine.
would you leave apart the other side?
Yeah, the other side is something that we hear every day on the mass media, whether it is MSNBC, Fox News, or CNN. I hate to say that some of the most, the only voice that breaks through on the corporate media tends to be Tucker Carlson on CNN, who has had his rants. Look, I don't like Tucker Carlson, but he's the one who talks about the need for negotiations because this is taking us into a world war. We can have a very different view of the context for all of this. I am certainly no fan of Putin, but I think we should be on the same page when we talk about where is it going. Every day that we prolong the war by keep the weapons flowing in is a day that more Ukrainians get slaughtered. Every day that we postpone serious negotiations is a day that more Ukrainians get slaughtered. So I think our goal is the same. We might have different ideas about how to get there.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your enlightenment today. There are many representations that I have, but none is more important to me than being a mother. And as I have seen the destructions that is happening to the Iranian people, I see them for the children. As a mother, my husband and I have been blessed with two amazing young ladies that we work every day to make certain that they are the light for humanity. One of the foundations that I have in terms of the principles is that first seek to understand, then to be understood in any conflict or concern. Now that 10-minute session, I don't know that you can accomplish that in 10 minutes. The question that I have, in every war, there is a victor. So we must examine that. If Russia is the victor, what next? If Ukraine is the victor, what next? When we understand the foundation of that, then we know where we need, how we need, what we need to do to resolve this atrocious war on our planet.
Thank you. There is no victor. There's always a lose-lose. I mean, there is a lose-lose, and there will be no victory. Either way that the two sides define it, there will not be a victory. And so what is needed is a compromise, and a compromise that can be sold to their people, all the people. Zelensky, when they were close to coming up with an agreement in March, it included a commitment by Ukraine that it would never become part of NATO, that it would be a neutral country, that it would not have foreign military bases on its soil, but that it would have guarantees by strong other countries that it would not be invaded again. And it included that Russian troops would leave, and it included that Crimea would be put off into the future, maybe 15 years down the road, to have a referendum on that, but it wasn't seen as something that had to be dealt with right away because there wasn't fighting going on in the Crimea. And that in the Donbass, they would have a situation similar to what was called for during the Minsk agreements, which would be a certain degree of autonomy. That people understand is going to be, was the basis of what a peace plan was. And Zelensky knew it would be tough to sell it to his people. He went on public television and he said, we are going to have to give up our dream of joining NATO. And when we have a plan, I will put it to the people for a vote. That hasn't happened yet, but that's what he said. That would be a compromise that he would then work hard to sell to his people. Russia, I think you have a more authoritarian possibility of Putin just deciding what was a compromise he was willing to live with. And that could be where the U.S. comes in, where the compromise would be that the U.S. would decide that it would not have nuclear weapons in European countries that were a threat. For example, there was something that the Russians had put forward early on when they were talking about a draft treaty. Remember I said in December they had come up with something? It included the parties will not deploy nuclear weapons outside their national territories, where the parties will not deploy ground-based intermediate-range and short-range missiles outside their territories that can attack targets in the national territories of other parties. I mean, these kinds of weapons agreements are things that could be, that Putin could tell to his people were a victory and that were a guarantee of the security interests of Russia. So those are the kinds of things that could be agreed upon and would be sold to the respective people. And of course, here in the United States, let Biden take credit for having solved the war. I mean, who cares who takes credit as long as it gets solved? But those are the kinds of things.
Hello, thank you for taking an incredibly complicated situation and making it compact for us to understand. One thing I've read about that you didn't mention is the role of profit in the push for war, which goes back decades, but in this particular situation, I understand it has really pushed things to the brink. So if you could address that, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that question. I mean, who profits from war? The people lose. It's a lose-lose for the people, not only in terms of getting killed, but where is all that money going that should be going to people's real needs and the needs of the planet? And in terms of who profits, well, we see that the weapons industry certainly has profited tremendously from this war, not only replacing the weapons that are going to Ukraine, but using it as a justification for the U.S. to then order 10 times the amount of weapons that they are giving to Ukraine. The energy companies are the winners in this because the U.S. energy companies have jumped in to replace the Russian-sanctioned energy in Europe. And I was in the Gulf of Texas not long ago where they said that all the work that they had been doing for years to stop the oil and gas companies from expanding has gone out the window because now they are getting new licenses and new refineries, and this is all to help our brothers and sisters in Europe. There are a lot of banks and investment firms, the biggest investment firm in this country called BlackRock, that are already setting up and signing memorandums of understanding with Zelensky in Ukraine for the rebuilding, because they know that there'll be billions and billions of dollars to go into rebuilding, and they want to profit from that. So there's profit made in the destruction, and there's profit made in the rebuilding, but it's the people who lose.
But did that play a role in pushing this toward where it's going?
Well, does that play a role in pushing this? You know, it's a complicated question, but let's recognize that what Eisenhower warned us about in the 1960s, the military-industrial congressional complex, is way, way bigger than he could have ever imagined, and includes the think tanks, the universities. I mean, it's just enormous. And there is so much money, and it's our money, that is sloshing around, that goes into the Pentagon. The Pentagon uses it then to have their lobbyists, who then also give money to congressional election campaigns, who build their weapons in local districts, who then say we need them here because it's part of our jobs program. There are so many ways that the corruption of this militarism leaks into our whole system. And then it affects the decision making. So if you have a Secretary of Defense who said we have to use this as an opportunity to weaken Russia, and where did he come from before he was Secretary of Defense? Well, he was in the military for a long time, but he also sat on the board of Raytheon, just like one of the Secretary of Defenses under Trump did. So it's Democrats, it's Republicans, it's this horrific revolving door between the Pentagon, the military contractors, the people in Congress, their election campaigns. We call this a democratic system, but I think it is extremely corrupt, and people benefit a lot from war.
There you go. Questions there?
My name is Audra Grace. I'm with the Decatur Presbyterian Church and the Peace and Justice Committee. I do admit that I have not read your book. I just had some folks speak to me. Is that better?
Yeah.
So I had some people bring to my attention some of the concerns that they had. And so I just wanted to ask, having not read your book, do you address that, so there's the statement that you're making that the West reneged on not expanding NATO eastward. Do you report in your book and speak of Putin saying on record as of 2012, after Poland and the Baltic states had joined, that every country can choose their own alliances? Is that something that's in your book?
Yeah, I mean, at one point, Putin was trying to very hard to make peace with the West, and talked about even, well, invite Russia into NATO. He was laughed at for that. At some point when 2008, when it was actually George Bush that forced the other NATO countries to say at that meeting that Ukraine and Georgia would be invited. Germany didn't want that to happen. France didn't want that to happen. Italy didn't want that to happen because they knew the consequences. And in fact, as soon as that happened, is when Russia said, well, we're going to have to take back Crimea. It is so interesting to look back at some of the documents from the U.S. government that have been leaked out, as well as public statements that were made, including by the present head of the CIA, William Burns, who said, it is a red line. It is a huge mistake for the U.S. to expand. Don't do it. It's not only Putin. It's the entire society. It's all of those in power in Russia. Same thing. Don't expand. And I just ask you to think about it in the U.S. context. Think about it. If Mexico or Canada wanted to join a hostile military alliance with Russia or with China, would the U.S. allow that to happen? I mean, go back and ask your people a yes or no answer about that, because I think we all know the answer would be absolutely not.
Medea, thank you for being here and planning your PC here. This is certainly fertile ground. I recall, and I think many of us here will remember when LBJ said that we lost Walter Cronkite. So turning to the presence of the media, how can the Democratic Party or Biden or whoever it is lose Rachel Maddow and others? Because I think that mobilization is the key, and media is very important to mobilization. So how do we get to a point that our media, and this MSNBC presumably, can turn, because that will draw in a lot of influence and force.
Yeah.
The question is, can we beat that clock that's continuing to tick?
Yeah. I think we have to, and it's a critical question, and I think it also can be from the people power that we are organizing. We have to put attention on the media. For example, when Seymour Hersh came out with his explosive article about Biden being the one who agreed to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, and for anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, please go back and read and research Seymour Hersh. The Nord Stream pipeline, the pipeline that brought oil from Russia into Western Europe, giving Germany the cheap gas that it needed for its whole manufacturing sector. When he published that report, for weeks, the New York Times and the Washington Post didn't say a word about it. And the Rachel Maddow, I don't know, some of them might have said something, but basically to say, oh, Seymour Hersh, he only had an unnamed source, you can't believe that, blah, blah, blah. The outcry has been tremendous from the bottom up and from people in the media questioning the U.S. government now. So there is an AP reporter named Matt Lee. He has been fantastic in the press conferences of grilling the U.S. government on these issues. And there has been so much pressure for the media to say, cover Seymour Hersh. If his article was wrong, tell us why it was wrong. If there's another explanation for who blew up the pipeline, tell us who did it. Investigate. Do your job. And so that's one example where I think we are having, in effect, embarrassing the media for not doing their job and pushing them to really investigate. And we're having a protest March 18th in Washington, D.C. that I hope will be a large-spirited one. And we're going to go to the Washington Post, and we're going to ask them, why aren't they covering this, that, we have to get on our media locally. People are doing a lot of work to push for a whole list of possible speakers we have, to get them on NPR, to get them out in the media, to get them interviewed. Jeffrey Sachs, you might have heard of him. He's one of the most authoritative people on this issue, having worked with the governments of both Ukraine and the government of Russia. He has not been able to get an op-ed piece in a major U.S. newspaper, and he has not been able to get on a major TV station except for once, and when he said it was the U.S. that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, they basically pulled the plug on him. So we have to get Jeffrey Sachs on the mainstream media. These are great campaigns, and they're really fun to do. And if you join us at Peace in Ukraine, you can work on these issues. I think, the last part of your question is, do we have the time? I think, we have no choice. We have to do this, and we have to do it together. We're building up from the bottom up, and we're getting the media, forcing the media to do its job.